unprecedented, and it's not the last time we're having this conversation, so I'm grateful for that. Now, in order to get us to even talk about what does radicalizing urban planning mean, I want us to ground us a little bit in kind of in how I ended up being an urban planner in the first place. So I became an urban planner by accident. I was born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, here in LA. And I was a youth organizer at the age of 16 with the Bus Riders Union. Now, if you know about the Bus Riders Union, you know about their famous case called the Consent Decree of 1996, where in partnership with the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, they were able to sue Metro and coin the term called transit racism, right? And they were looking at the ways in which Metro was allocating their budget in relationship to where the demographic of bus riders. And so what they realized at that time was that the Metro was allocating 70% of their budget to the construction of light rail and highway, when most of the ridership for Metro was actually in buses and by people of color. With the Consent Decree of 1996, the Bus Riders Union is able to win this lawsuit, and they basically created a freeze and fare hikes for Metro between the years 1996 and 2003. Do not quote me on that. I do not remember my dates, but I was a 16-year-old talking about transit racism in the Bus Riders Union. From there, I've only known community organizing, and I ended up actually going into school just with a degree in social work. And as a social worker, I was more interested, rather than doing individual case management, in looking at macro social work and the ways that systems impact the needs of our clients in the first place. From that conversation, when talking with a professor of ours at USC, Lisa Schweitzer, she was like, "Richard, you are an urban planner," and then brings us where we are now. So currently as an urban planner, I work as a community engagement specialist for Los Angeles Vision Zero at the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. So most of what I'm going to speak on today comes from those experiences, right? I'm coming from a disenfranchised community, South Central, coming in as an organizer with the Bus Riders Union, and my work now as in Vision Zero. And I'm also an artist. And the reason I bring up the work of art is because art has allowed me to really understand in the ways in which metaphor and qualitative research, which is not so much given enough value in our work, is actually very powerful in the ways that we can actually engage community. So that's a little bit of who I am and where I come from and how this conversation came to be. And now here's a historical context, right? So in this section, we also know that on this call are folks who may not be urban planners. And historically, there have been systems and mechanisms that continue to perpetuate systemic racism in communities. The one we has become a hot topic in recent years that we know is redlining, right? And it's a term coined in the 60s, and it was based on the way how lenders would literally map out neighborhoods based on their desirability, right? And how we would invest in those neighborhoods alone. At that time, it was Black and Jewish neighborhoods that were the most likely to be redlined or considered undesirable. Lenders would make those loans lower, not accessible at higher interest rates, and then thus we created these sort of segregations within cities, right? And now redlining as a practice is illegal, but the data still shows, especially when we look at, for example, in Vision Zero High Injury Network, where we know that 60% of crashes are happening in 6% of the city streets in Los Angeles. And all of those streets, when you overlay them with the redlining map, tend to happen in zones that were redlined at one point, right? And so we begin to see the consequences of disinvestment and negligence also being correlated to redlining. Another tactic that is used is eminent domain, and it refers to the power that government has to take private property and convert it into public use. Some of the most prominent cases, specifically here in Los Angeles, is the erasure of the Chavez Ravine community that was then through eminent domain, that land was taken and the Dodger Stadium was then built. Same way with Manchester Square and the construction of LAX. An urban renewal, it's a term that it's granted by the government, right, to address blighted or slum neighborhoods. And governments tore down buildings and low-cost housing where low-income, often Black and brown folks communities lived in order to build more wealthy residents, right? And this process in itself leads us to where we are now, and what we know is gentrification. And gentrification is the process of changing the character of a neighborhood where old residents, usually communities of color, are changed by an influx or more affluent, usually white residents, and businesses come in to change the character of the neighborhood. What you see here, the picture that you see, is the monstrosity that I live by, which is the USC, University of Southern California University Village. Now, this project is a $40 million project that was created. And what it resulted in is in that little monstrosity. And before, the old village actually was more open to community, with grocery stores that had accessible prices for the community. There was a local theater, a food court with local mom and pop shops inside of the food court. And now, in recent years, since the project has opened, clearly the design in itself tells community members that they are no longer welcomed here. One of the amenities that was not added in this project was the theater. The president at the time very openly stated that he didn't want folks to come into the theater, or didn't want the theater because it brought people from the community. And so these are projects that continue to change the character of neighborhoods. And even now, developers like Triple Link is one of the big ones here in the area, buy buildings in residential blocks and make them into these luxury apartments that are usually for students, and thus changing the property value of the neighboring community. And there are countless stories of folks who live around USC, of community members who have been displaced. So what is this notion of radicalizing urban planning? So to go back a little bit to the conversation around gentrification, when I first came into the program and talked about gentrification, to me, the pattern in which gentrification works, right, the power differentials, the relationship between landlords and tenants, was very reflective to what we in social work, deal with when we are talking with clients who are survivors of intimate partner violence. So then from there, it was like, well, how do we then reimagine and say, well, what would it look like if we were to apply this framework to gentrification, to create something called displacement violence? And so those are the ways in which sort of the intersections between social work and urban planning make sense to me. And an idea that comes from that is, what I'm calling the 3 R's of radicalizing urban planning. And the first step, which honestly I think we all are taking in this call, is recognizing that the profession has been it's been complicit to systemic racism. It has been in its inception. I personally believe that the profession is rooted in colonization, and what we're seeing now through gentrification is just a neo-colonialism, and that's a whole nother Zoom call and a whole nother conversation on how we can decolonize urban planning. The second step would definitely be reconciling with the fact that the relationships between planners and community, those relationships have been tethered. And we need to rebuild that relationship in that community in order to ensure that we're doing this work justly. And the last one is resiliency, right? And resiliency refers to how are we designing projects, ensuring that these mechanisms don't continue to affect the communities that we're hoping that we can work with, right? So how do we build mechanisms and systems where projects are not going to result in the displacement of current residents? How are we ensuring that though redlining is no longer a practice, redlining continues to permeate through the field, that we recognize that, we reconcile with that, and we build communities that are resilient to these systems. Now, a little bit about social work practice, because I think social workers, we are undervalued, and we have a lot more, I think, people-centered, people-focused approaches to the work that we do. And one of those is called the person and environment perspective. And that is a little graphic that you are seeing also on this slide. When we as social workers work with clients, what we do is that we focus primarily on our client, right? We start at the individual level, and we then begin to understand the systems in which they are a part of. The microsystem being families, schools, churches, the mesosystem, the in-between, neighbors and the relationships that happen between that and those dynamics, and then the macro systems, right? And so I think what happens a lot of the time in urban planning is that we do a reverse and intention of power. What I mean by that is that we do something more like environment with people. And I only bring that to say, while I was in school, and I grew up less than a mile away from USC. I grew up literally in this neighborhood. But I was in a program that was comprised of 90% of people who were not people of color and who were not from Los Angeles. And when you have these conversations in the classroom, folks, would very much speak in dichotomous ways and othering the community. And I had to sit there and be like, but wait, but the people live there. They're my parents, they're my friends, my school. What are you talking about? And so rather than thinking of this environment and romanticizing the environment, something that specifically happens in Los Angeles, I am a firm believer that planners who are not from LA begin to plan for a city, for an exported image of Los Angeles, right? An image that is consumed in mass media that says this is how we should be planning for Los Angeles moving forward. We get into a conversation of then the construction of light rail and the push for more light rail when our bus systems are much more expensive than the light rail system. But that's a whole nother conversation, right? Another bullet point to bring in there is strengths perspective. As social workers, we believe that showing up for clients is half the battle. Our job is to show up when the rest of society won't. So as we saw the pandemic sort of play out across the country and across the globe, one of the most famous memes that came out were social workers ready to go to the forefront. And it's part of our nature. It's why we come into the profession. But the strengths perspective can be applied to communities, right? Rather than looking at communities that have deficits, it's how do we look at our approach and saying these are asset-based communities. These are the assets and the systems that are already working in place. And our job as planners should not be to change those systems, but rather to amplify them. The last two, systems theory and case management, sort of refers to how we treat our projects in the social work field. Specifically within case management, we're always doing follow-up. We're always terminating our clients with this follow-up conversation, and it's something that I don't see happen too often in at least in transportation planning, right? A lot of the times when we speak with community, it's always with the intention of buy-in, and it's always happening at the pre-design and design phase of a project, but never during construction. And to me, that is a disservice to community, right? Construction tends to be the longest phase in a project, and also the phase where community feels the most impact. So what would it look like to create community engagement strategies during construction and evaluation? How do we continue to build those relationships? Lastly, intersectionality, term coined by the amazing Kimberly Crenshaw, and it speaks to really how are we looking at our different sectors within the profession intersectionally, right? So even though I am at the Department of Transportation, how do I listen and validate community who are talking to me and telling me, why are you spending this money on this transportation project when you could be spending it on the homelessness crisis, right? Like, how are we having these conversations? Because one thing that we also need to recognize as urban planners is that community members don't experience the built environment in these sectors and silos, right? It's always one conversation between another. Folks don't cross the street and all of a sudden recognize they're in LA County, born and raised in LA, and I still don't know the lines between LA City and LA County. It's a mess. And so really applying the realm of intersectionality is important in our work, and that we're speaking to one another, and that different departments are really collaborating with one another, and that we're really speaking to what the needs are in the community. So what can we do? All that being said, right? What now? One of the first steps, or one of the conversations that we had, is how do we shift this idea of community engagement to community empowerment? So one of the conversations that came up with us in the first call was looking at the fact that funding for community engagement is always the hardest funding, right? So it's not, how do we ensure that when we're creating budgets for our projects, that we're ensuring that community engagement is a hard cost in the budget as opposed to a soft cost, right? If something happens and changes in the construction timeline, how are we ensuring that that community engagement is not the first thing to be, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the chipped at. One of the ways in which we've been able to really talk about community engagement in the terms of empowerment is in really looking and analyzing and including a power analysis in our community engagement efforts, right? So in the work that we do with Vision Zero, I've been fortunate enough to be given the liberty from time to time to engage with community members and do trainings. And one of our trainings that we did, we included a power map. Now, a power mapping is a tool that is used in community organizing. And what it allows us to do is to create a map, right? And a strategy of who are the different stakeholders in our conversation, what is our goal, and how do we strategize to get our goal, right? Specifically for Vision Zero, it's how do we get to zero deaths, It's an ambition goal that deserves ambition solutions. And so when we did our power mapping, a very important thing to do in that exercise was to place ourselves as a department within that power map. And it allows community members to know the mechanisms to which to hold us accountable. Specifically in Los Angeles, right, we have the side of the community, the west side of the community, that sort of comes to us as government officials and says, you should be doing this for us, and you need to be doing this for us. And when we spoke to community members in South Central and other more disenfranchised communities, the number one thing that comes up is what can we do to be better? From then, it's been sort of my job and in the way that I've worked and says, how do I then create the same sort of empowerment for communities in South Central to treat me with the same comportment that folks do on the West Side, right? So not only are we doing engagement, but we're also empowering communities. Another conversation that came up is, do our community engagement strategies even include equity? Right? Do we perpetuate the model that happens a lot in the show Parks and Recs, right? The open forum conversation, or especially with planners, do we just bring out maps and ask folks to put post-its on a map, and then all of a sudden we're discovering what they're saying to us? Is that really engagement, or is equity really being what's the word? Permeating right through our engagement strategies? And what does that even look like? Some of the things that can happen is, specifically in our work, we are ensuring that we try to find ways to remove all barriers for access for folks to come to our meetings, right? Whether it is childcare, whether it is live in real-time translation, whether it is access to transit to come to our meetings, or whether it's snacks, right? Ensuring that our ways in which we're engaging with community has the community in mind first, rather than us as planners. And lastly, another thing that came up was, do we even compensate fairly our community-based organization partners, right? So moving on to this next slide, one of the most popular models that is used there is Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. If you look at the bottom, the ways and strategies in which it's been used, this idea of manipulation and therapy and informing, these are non-participatory mechanisms, right, in which the community is just telling us and informing us with information. They are sharing their lived experiences, but we are not leveraging and compensating enough their lived experience as technical experience. And we continue to move up, right? When we consult on these CBOs and we tokenize them and we say, well, we worked with that one advocacy group, so we're doing the work, right? And what we're noticing now, even in the conversation and everything that's going on, it's that it's not enough. I still find it kind of sad that, again, being at Vision Zero, at LA's Vision Zero at the Department of Transportation, I am one of the few people of color in that division and one of the few Native Angelinos in that division. And I am not the spokesperson for South Central or communities of color by all means, but it's really looking at how even internally we have the capacity to hire, that we're really ensuring that we're hiring folks who have the lived experience, who can come in as consultants and get those consulting fees, because I know y'all know some consultants be charging $200 an hour for things that community members will do, you know? So being really mindful of how we're leveraging the power, specifically also in how we're then kind of amplifying more control to community through the role of delegating that work and just giving even community the control to do their own development and their own engagement. Another conversation that comes up is divesting from the police. Now, when it comes to land use law, at least in California, the police department are the ones that hold that power in jurisdiction over what land use should look like, right? And specifically now, right, through the People's Budget LA, we're looking at a city whose mayor was allocating over 50% of the budget to the police department. Now, the People's Budget LA conducted their own survey of 24,000 surveys, and they realized that mostly folks did not want that funding to be going to law enforcement and policing, but rather looking at universal aid and crisis management, the built environment, and reimagining community safety. Now, the built environment is specifically talking to urban planners, right? And if we look on the image on the On the right here, from the Washington Post, an article that came out, we see that over the last couple of decades, the discrepancy between funding for law and order and welfare continues to widen, and that gap continues to widen. So we continue to fight for funding even within our own selves, right? I'm being completely transparent. I'm gonna get in trouble, but we'll deal with the consequences later. But Vision Zero goal is to reach zero traffic deaths by 2025. It's now 2020, and our numbers are showing that we have failed. We have. Traffic fatalities continue to go up in Los Angeles, and we had about 132 traffic-based fatalities in 2019. Do not quote me on that number. But it continues to happen. And really what it is, and it's not necessarily that, the team internally is not doing their work. On the contrary, we're trying to do the work as much as we can, and we don't have the funding, and we don't have someone to champion our work internally. Yep, that's where I'm gonna get in trouble. And so when we look at the data from the People's Budget, this is the way in which they looked at the different sectors in which folks were wanting more budget, right? These are the results that came up. We see a lot here in the built environment that folks really want more funding for public transportation, right? Specifically in Los Angeles, we have an MOU with the police department, and it's something that I've heard it's not just Los Angeles, right? But armed police officers should not be riding on buses or on light rails. They shouldn't, right? And even when we look at the funding, an increase in law enforcement doesn't correlate to a decrease in crime, right? Like there is no real studies that show that correlation. And we're also would be saving money if we would make fare free as opposed to like funding, these officer salaries to be on those buses. And when we look back at sort of what folks want to be divesting from, and again, this is information from the People's Budget LA report, they're looking at defunding mostly law enforcement and policing, specifically the city attorney's office, parking enforcement, and police and policing. So here is the last conversation that came up. Within here in the US, we have the APA, the American Planners Association, and there's a certification, right, the AICP certification that sort of evaluates these three criteria. The professional level of responsibility and resourcefulness while applying to a planning process appropriate to project or situation, evaluating the impacts to a community when implementing professional planning tasks, and influence public decision-making in the public interest, right? We were talking of what would it look like if we had an equitable planner certification. And so here on the right side, we see a three-step process, right? What would it look like to include equity as one of the existing criteria for AICP? The second step would be to create a specialization within the already existing AICP certification, the AICP Equitable Planner specialization. And the last step would be a creation of a certification in equitable planning. Now, what would be the purpose of this, right? And the idea behind creating an equitable planner certification would be to ensure that planners are consistently staying up to date with equitable planning tactics and strategies, or staying up to date to how the ways in which systemic racism are having these conversations, to be honest, and how systemic racism permeates through the field, and are continuing to get accredited and are staying up to date. Now, in addition to that, we can also urge local city and local government agencies to urge that when they put out their RFPs, that they include or ask for at least one of the team members of their partners, one of the team members to be certified as an equitable planner, thus allowing community to know who to go to when to hold accountable, right? And so then lastly, we're getting toward the end of this little section, and we'll open it up to conversations from here. I just also wanted to highlight the work of these three amazing women of color who are doing the work in transportation planning here in Los Angeles. Caro Vera, a transportation planner with Fair and Pierce. Her Twitter handle is right there. Dr. Destiny Thomas, a transportation planner with the Thrive-Ins Project. You should definitely read her article on You Can't Talk About Open Streets Are Not Safe for Black Lives. And then Tamika Butler, a transportation planner at Tool Design, and their Twitter handles. And the reason I bring them up is because I need to highlight their work as well. I am not the only one having these conversations. Neither are my colleagues here as well. So really uplifting the work that is already continuing is important. And then lastly, Here are a couple of links that are going to be added into the chat box for the different pieces. Safe Streets Are Not Safe for Black Lives is the piece that Destiny Thomas wrote for City Lab. Why We Must Talk About Race When We Talk About Bikes, article written by Tamika Butler. And if you have not already signed up for the Thrive-Ins group, the Unurbanist Assembly happening tomorrow, a 23-hour teach-in around the same topics that conversations we're having today, that link is going to be added. And again, that is tomorrow. Okay. That was a lot that was said. So now we're going to open up the conversation. And what we're going to do from here, you are going to go to under participants. You can raise your hand, and then one of our co-hosts is going to cue you in for conversation.
Okay, so we also want to be cognizant of how many people are on this call and how much time you want to take up. So if you are going to introduce yourself, I would just ask to keep it brief, but we really want to focus on your question or your comment or your idea that you want to share to the group. So we'll start off with Liza Birkin. And let's see. You're not unmuted yet. Hold on, we'll get to it. There we go. Okay, I think you're unmuted now.
Hello, I am so sorry. I did not mean to raise my hand. It was a Zoom glitch, and I'm going to pass it on to the next person. Thank you so much for having us. This is amazing.
Sure.
Liza.
Sam Lerman.
Hello, I'm Sam Lerman, pronouns they, them, student at Occidental College. So I read from Dr. Thomas's article a while back, and it's overall really good, but I'm just wondering if there are any cities that have managed to reduce traffic violence and particulate pollution from vehicle traffic without car control measures.
Yeah, thank you for that. To be completely honest, I'm not sure if there are any cities that have that information. If anyone else has that information, please add it to the chat box. What I will say to the point of that, right, I was able to work under Dr. Destiny Thomas, which I'm grateful for. And one of the conversations that came up really specifically was around one of our engagement strategies that we had after the fatality of a young person, a car crash here in LA. And we realized that we were going to be hosting this small little walk that did not necessarily require parking or permits for assembly, but rather we were thinking of like, how are we using the resources within the Department of Transportation without having to bring on the police? Now for that specific event, which was only for full 500 folks, it was 1,500 feet. It wasn't a big demonstration. They wanted to have five police vehicles present and with armed officers. And we were like, y'all don't need to do this if you're trying to control traffic, right? Within the Department of Transportation, we have something called special traffic operations, whose job is to ensure that this is happening and flowing. So the conversation then becomes, right, how do we begin to say that there are ways in which that safety does not have to equal police, right? That community safety does not have to equal police. And specifically in the work of Vision Zero, we don't necessarily need to have these armed officers who are enforcing traffic violations. And so that's, I think, where the conversation is just starting. I know NACTO was beginning a conversation today, and it was already getting heated. So as more information comes up, I'll definitely be sure to follow that through and add that information. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, so Tamara Nahal.
Hi there. So I had a question based on how to reframe Vision Zero in a way that takes equity into consideration, especially in racialized suburbs. So I'm calling in from Toronto, where a lot of our racialized communities live in suburban parts of Toronto, and the Vision Zero conversation often talks about slowing down fast-moving vehicles, which are predominantly concentrated in neighborhoods where people living there are people of color. And there's a lot of concern about how do we do this in a way that's equitable and doesn't involve increasing police budgets, because that is primarily where the conversation has gone. And I was wondering if there are any resources or if there's anyone who's talking about what does safe streets in predominantly racialized suburban communities look like. That would really get to the root of that question, and how can we advocate for that and work with them. Thanks.
Yeah, a couple of points there. I think one of the things, especially now we're having the conversation right at divesting from police, I think is very important also for us as planners to take ownership of the city budget, because we, are in direct matrimony in some ways with the city budget, and we need to advocate from within the inside, right? Now that we're seeing this conversation happen specifically and for the People's Budget LA, I think that it's my job as someone who works for Vision Zero to advocate for the inside and say, well, look, if we get this funding, this is where we need that funding, right? And it doesn't have to be giving that funding to police officers like you mentioned. I think Dr. Destiny Thomas does a wonderful job. She taught me everything that I know about infusing dignity and equity in our work in Vision Zero. So I would definitely read her article and follow up through the Unurbanist Assembly for sure. One of the things that I've seen sort of in how we address equity, and again, it's talking about that transportation or traffic safety is not just a transportation issue. It's a housing issue. It's a community development issue. It's an education issue, right? How we get to zero deaths, it's a whole culture shift and a paradigm shift, right? How do we reprioritize and center the pedestrian and not the car? And I think that's one of the hard conversations that we have, especially a lot in Vision Zero work, right? When we talk about bike lanes, and it's certain communities that are advocating for bike lanes and other communities who are not, and then you get into a racialized conversation. But I think for me, for within the insight, is that getting to zero deaths means centralizing my work around pedestrians and around children. And again, how we get to that part, it's a multi-tier, multi-level avenue, but I think we just need to have that conversation and push folks from the inside, right? Let me not say that because I'm gonna get in trouble. But I would love to see more folks who have that decision-making power, right, at the general manager level to make that stance. Okay, that's it before I get in trouble. Thank you.
And also, this is a discussion. So if somebody asks a question, we obviously were on the same page as you. We're probably all very, we have different people in this call with different levels of profession and experience and skills. So if there's a particular question or comment that you feel like you have a lot of knowledge in, feel free to raise your hand and you can follow up on that too. So our next speaker may be a call-in, but your number 16613.
Hi everyone, my name is Cecilia Martinez. I'm a recent grad at CSUN at California State University, and I don't think I have a question. Mine is more like a comment. I'm a transit rider, and I took the metro. I went to the beach this weekend, and I took the metro, and Metro has a whole ass sign that says "We stand with Black Lives Matter" and something about George Floyd. But when I was in the metro, I just kept thinking about how we police all the folks in the metro, the houseless folks in the metro, and how the majority of the people that I saw, at least during that day, were Black. And how contradicting they are, because even during the protesting, the first Saturday when the march on Fairfax, how they the metro stopped running, and how are we holding LA Metro accountable during these times, because they're saying they're supporting the movement, but it's you literally left us. I couldn't even take the bus back home. And I just wanted to I guess ask for ideas on how do we hold this or transportation company accountable to actually show support for the movement. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think to be completely frank with you, I think that since the consent decree of 1996 passed, and again in 1996, we have not seen a civil class action to that extent where community members partnered up to sue Metro, an agency, to say you are not doing enough. In my dream, I wish there is another one. Let's sue Metro, sue the Department of Transportation too, sue Vision Zero. Oh, okay, then I got in trouble now. But, I definitely think that that's right, that these agencies need to be held accountable because their measures and the way that they're comporting themselves is showing that they're mostly bending over for white fear and not community engagement.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right, and we definitely need a balance of having public safety in metro stations and metro stops, but at the same time is not specifically targeting certain areas too. We have all of these sometimes unfounded fears of transportation, and even now, even more unfounded fears with the coronavirus. But that's a great question. Like, we need public safety, but there's definitely there's an imbalance happening at the same time. So the next person we have is Adrienne Ayala. If you have a comment or idea. I think I said questions in the beginning, but it's not really questions. It's just your thoughts, what you want to say.
Hey, Adrian, give me 1 second. I want to also make sure that we're shouting out to the conversations that are happening in the chat box. One of the conversations was saying that Metro board meeting is coming up next week. We should show up, and definitely the ways in which somebody else mentioned that community engagement has changed during this time at LA City Council. Those LA City Council meetings have been lit the last couple of weeks. We should definitely show up for Metro board meetings as well. Adrian, thank you so much.
I just wanted to say thank you, Jose, in the first place for organizing all this. It's been really great so far. My name is Adriana Ayala. I'm a Rutgers student in the Master of City and Regional Planning program. From what we've heard so far, I mean, I know a lot of people know this as well. It's extremely hard even affecting change from inside an organization, especially inside a transportation planning organization. And I was just wondering if you had anything to say or any tips on being a planner within a private consultancy that gets contracts from city governments like LA, for example, and how we can include equity in our designs when it doesn't necessarily increase the bottom line, and it's not necessarily a priority for private consultancies. And I mean, than it is for city and state governments.
Yeah, so one of the things that has happened to me within the Department of Transportation has been this. So in one of the meetings, right, so basically what my job was to build something called RISE, Rapid Implementation and Survivor Engagement Strategy. And it was a way to engage with community members after fatality has happened. How do we look at the infrastructure and assess the infrastructure for possible contributors to the collision in itself, rather than looking at behavior? We know that the media tends to kind of, racialize and criminalize behavior when it leads to traffic collisions. So we were looking at how do we create a more trauma-informed planning, just given my background in social work and urban planning. And I did the rookie mistake to write in an email, I found deficiencies in an intersection. And the first thing that came up was that my supervisor was like, girl, do not write deficiencies, because if we get sued and public records, they're gonna come and say that you wrote this in the email. And I was like, okay, please, by all means, take me to court. Now, what you think is that my commitment is to the city, but it's not. I'm here to advocate for my client, and it happens to be the resident. And I saw deficiencies. What do you want me to do? And so I think that's one of the hard things that I've been battling with being in the government. I've learned that I dislike the government more than I like to work for it. You know what? Just putting that out there. If I get fired, and a few folks hired in LA, holler at your person. But we're told too often about the protocols and the red tapes and the things that can't be done. And then you ask them for the protocol and it doesn't exist. Right? And so from understanding that really what's happening within the system is just a political game, and folks are legit doing things behind the pettiness of politicians, let me tell you. And so I think for me, the advice that I can give and the things that I've learned is that nobody taught me that the moment I acquired a city badge, I also acquired city baggage. So it was kind of hard to build relationships with CBOs where I was like, yo, we are on the same philosophy. Like, I am a bus rider, and I was a bus rider not because, unlike some of the white planner folks that I know, decided to not own a car. I couldn't afford a car. And then when I could, I was just like, I'm just a bus rider. How do we hold each other and be like, I'm on the inside, let me leverage what I know and let's work together. Let's have off-record conversations. These fools are having it all the time. So let's strategize together. So one, how do you build relationships between that? And self-care. How do we take care of one another? Because working within the inside, when you tend to be one of the only people of color, one of the only queer people of color, one of the only Native people, you know, folks who were born and raised in the city in these departments, it gets very, very daunting on you. So I would say one, it's a long fight, but it's a good fight for sure. Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, great. Okay, Amanda Pena.
Hey, I just have to shout out, first of all, thank you guys so much for putting this together. Jose, I'm also a social work urban planning student right now.
Yeah.
I'm a dual degree. I was born and raised in Whittier, so from Los Angeles, but right now I'm in Philadelphia. So I'm at the University of Pennsylvania. So Adrian, I'm not too far from you over at Rutgers. Anyways, so I preface with all of that because I also think that there's so much to be learned about social work and urban planning. And I was, you know, diving really deep into the social services and social work as like an organizer and doing direct service. And so I fell into urban planning and I realized that it actually, there's just so many intersections with every possible discipline that you can imagine. I mean, so many people think that urban planning, one of my biggest arguments was that a lot of urban planners are coming from architecture backgrounds, geography backgrounds, you know, economics. They're coming from these perspectives, and then they have no idea how to humanize the conversation or like community participatory action research. So that the whole paradigm is not there. And I think that that's something that's really important to call out, but also just folks who aren't planners, aren't social workers, and in any other realm, a lot of times you have to think about what is the background that folks are coming in to this field with. So when you look at like accounting firms, I know there are like folks that are like interested in like, you know, becoming CPAs or like going into public administration. Like a lot of people take these specific paths like political science or, you know, history or whatever, but there's very few opportunities to develop those really tangible, like grassroots community organizing type skills that are necessary for community empowerment. So I guess to kind of, with all of that in the context, I don't know if anyone here does research specifically on the role of education in schools in community development. Right now, my research is on trauma in communities and how schools exacerbate trauma through the use of policing. And so a lot of what my research is looking at right now is how we can involve parents and children and families in the school system to kind of advocate for themselves and start building this network where we can start to hear very real needs by district, by campus, where students and families are like, hey, in our neck of the woods, right, we're all part of one school district, but in our neck of the woods, these are the things that we don't have. So kind of that community budget or the people budget that you had showed. You know, I'm really trying to get schools, school campuses to start laying out their needs and then using these partners, bankers, you know, the hospitals and schools and local businesses, like how can we wrap this all around based on our local school system? Because every child has to pass through the school system at some point, and that is where you can really get families involved in the advocacy process. So I know I said a mouthful and I don't really know if there was a question or anything there, but like I'm spinning in this circle with my research because the people that I'm interacting with are like in a very different mindset of how they're looking at community development. And so I bring this up to everyone here on all the pages that I can't see, because if any of that, if a thread of any of that sounds interesting to you, or like you have thoughts about that or work on that, I would love to interact with people just to continue building this network, because to really change a paradigm is going to take so many people to keep like, you know, plucking these threads out of the tapestry to get people to like see it unravel and then rebuild. So anyways, long-winded, I do that. I go on tangents, but anyways, y'all are awesome. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Amanda, for bringing that up. So a couple of things that came to mind, right? So I definitely think that that's one of the things that is missing a lot, especially with working with traffic engineers, is that they forget that people live there. and they forget that people kind of navigate this space, right? So one of the most beautiful things and honors that I've been able to have to do is that also as a choreographer, my job is to choreograph space within space, right? Like, yes, I'm dancing and performing on stage, but I'm always designing and looking at movement and behavior analysis. And one of the things that we were able to look was at looking at intersections and looking at the choreography of intersections, looking at the number of vehicles versus pedestrians and sort of the interactions and behaviors that are happening at intersections to fully understand what are the needs and how the infrastructure may not be amplifying the needs that community is already presenting itself. So that was one strategy that was used there. There was also a conversation in the chat box around restorative justice in transportation planning. Listen, it has not happened in what I've seen, but one thing that we did do when I was given permission at the Department of Transportation, I hosted a healing circle it was called the South LA Healing Circle by the Department of Transportation. Now, that I know, I think this might have been the first ever healing circle that a government agency was like, yes. And of course, after that, there were no more healing circles, and people were just like, why do we have this healing circle? And honestly, the participants from that healing circle are the groups of people who are the first ones to volunteer and want to get involved with Vision Zero, because for 2 hours, we as planners and engineers did nothing but listened. It was like a whole group therapy session, but they didn't know. But any good social worker knows that the moment you hear what I'm hearing is we're actually therapizing you, and we're just reflecting back to what you told us. So to your point, Amanda, one of the conversations that came up right as we're trying to discover what it is that we're going to do after, again, we did not foresee 250 of y'all to get on a call today. I'm very happy that I paid for that 300 people subscription, because 100 of you were not about to get on this call. But one of the things that we talked about is that there's not enough training at least in our curriculum as planners at USC around community engagement and actual participatory methods that are not performative, right? Someone in the chat called it performative activism, and it happens all the time. So one of the things that we considered doing after this is maybe doing a community organizing 101 for urban planners, and being like, this is what I learned how to do as a community organizer with the Bus Riders Union. I go back to it, 15 years later. And it's something that always helps me. So that might be something that we do that we'll share with y'all. And again, we are going to share that sign-in sheet, that form that was in the beginning. And what we're going to do with that, there's a question that talks about what city you're in. And we're going to send the emails in clusters based on locations to also create little networks from the folks who are already in your cities. I see a couple.
Great. So Anish Taylor.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks so much for putting this together. I'm really enjoying this content. I am a Master's of Urban Planning student at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I just wanted to make a comment. Richard, one of the things that resonated the most with me that you said was when you're at Vision Zero, you're trying to center the pedestrian. And that is something that resonated because when I was a community organizer before I moved to Chicago in DC for South Asian LGBTQ people, one of the things we did was we centered the most marginalized members of our community. And when we did that, the community as a whole benefited. So that's a mindset that I bring with me to planning. And when I cross that concept over in planning, I think about who the most marginalized person would be. It would be the pedestrian, or it would be, kids using the outdoor space. So I like that rhetorical device. And the other thing that resonated was, well, my question had to do with what can students do so that they enter the field with this level of awareness? Because I agree with you when you said urban planning as a field is a form of neocolonialism. So planning students, what can they do so that they can refrain from acting as neocolonialists when they actually enter the field?
Yeah, to answer that question, check their ego. And what I mean by that is so many times I have colleagues who have said things along the lines of like, you know what, I think I'm gonna run for city council because that's the only way I can push my projects forward. And I'm like, fool, it's not about you. It's about the community. So one, I think it's even calling out that that entitlement. And a lot of these colleagues are white colleagues who come into, so there's always two type of planners that come into the field. The planner that comes into the field because they want to preserve and defend their hood, right, from gentrification, and we come from this place of community organizing. And then there's the planner that romanticizes the city. And I think that's where it gets a little bit faulty, right? When we look at even in how, okay, so I was a little wild in graduate school and said some things that were like, so one of the things that we looked at, or what I looked at particularly, it's the male gaze and the patriarchal influence that happens in city planning. When you think of any sort of documents that talk about the city, we always see it from an aerial view. Thus, we other ourselves from the city as a planner, but we never build and imagine the city from the pedestrian's level. And I think even that mind frame and that paradigm shift can really get us to talk about what is happening on the street, not what is happening at an aerial view. Google Images can now help us with that. And the second thing, there was something that came, oh, okay, here it is. And so one of the things that I've noticed in the field that happens a lot of the times is that, as we know, the planning process is a series of decisions that get made along the way, right? And at that decision-making process, there's always something that happens, that there's always has to be a trade-off. How do we equip our planners to advocate on behalf of community who cannot be in those conversations because the first thing we're willing to trade off is the dignity of community? And it happens all the time, right? If we're going to cut a budget, it's going to be in community engagement. Well, we can no longer provide childcare. Well, we can no longer provide translations. Well, we can no longer do this. We can no longer host healing circles. And I think it's ensuring in those ways from the inside. One, I think being better equipped as students and as planners to have these conversations, the hard conversations, those same conversations that we've been asked to have within our families around anti-Blackness are the same conversations we need to be having within our colleagues, with our employers, with our elected officials, and with people who have the capacity to make those decisions. Thank you.
If I can jump in a second.
Yeah.
We had really good examples in our class when we were students of people or friends of ours who went to the community and asked them what they want to research about. So involve yourself with the community, but also within the flexibility that you have in the class projects, do something for the community you are a part of, or for that time you're in school, you're now a part of. So go there, listen to their voices, give them the research that they need so they can fight for their rights.
Cool. Before we go to the next person, Hakeem, there's some good stuff happening in the chat. So Carla Danessa had a really good suggestion, and I know something that people try to do about how the metrics we use to evaluate the pros and cons of the projects, we need to look at it from a racial equity lens, because right now you think about all of the metrics we use to evaluate like efficiency or productiveness or how well a plan is laid out is from years old, white lens. So I think that's like a tangible action item that people can take to the projects if you're in the public or private sector, right? Like there's usually that last 2 pages or so, a part of your document or your plan where it says, like, well, what are the metrics you're going to use to evaluate this plan? Like you can fight for a couple line items in there to talk about how this is equitable and add that racial equity lens to that. Okay, so Hakeem.
Hi, everybody. My name's Hakeem. I'm a planner with Los Angeles. And I want to echo a lot of what has been said already. The history of planning is very segmented and segregated and racial from its inception. And a lot of the solutions that are needed have to be very radical. And in a lot of ways, that be incremental and implemented in a regular fashion. I'm particularly a project planner, and I work in the housing space quite a bit. And one of the curiosities that really begs my attention is really like the connection between equity and property and the relationship to wealth generation in communities of color. And then there's also the corresponding pirating, if I can't think of another word, but of that same equity within communities of color. You gave an example of the USC project, and I could see that happening there. But at the same time, we're coming to an age where we're talking about more inclusiveness, where we're having communities that are mixed in income and racial makeup. and there's less brutality, and there's freedom. And it just makes me wonder, what are some of the ways that some of the youth, I hear a lot of college students here, are thinking about. What are you guys thinking about in the classroom to solve some of these things? And if there are any opportunities to work with you guys, I'd be happy to hear from you to start implementing some of those things in the areas that I work, if possible. So that's my contribution to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Hakeem. So a couple of things to that, and specifically why I bring up the project, the USC Village project. One, it's very personal. I grew up in the old village. But one of the things that comes up a lot is that when this new project was introduced to the community, the way that it was told to the community is that it was going to include, bring in 1,500 new jobs. Now, 1,500 new jobs at the salary at which they were getting paid and not being on university payroll, meaning that they were not getting access to tuition remission, they were not getting access to healthcare, to me is not equitable in the lens of like, in your project still costs $40 million. It's not an equitable transaction that happens there when we look at the livelihood of community, right? Rather than just creating jobs, we're seeing again in this frame of intersectionality that community is not necessarily just sort of going to work in the community, but they live in the community and all of the businesses. So one of the biggest controversies of the project is that over the last year, a lot of the shops that were at the village have closed because nobody can afford them. And I was like, well, isn't that surprising? And so I think that's one of the ways in which we don't think things through in that regard. Another conversation that came up as well is how do we put out a call out for land use lawyers to do pro bono legal services for communities and CBOs who may not have the capacity to hire them, right? So when we have projects that when projects come up, and a lot of the times when folks are sort of, up against developers hire land use lawyers to do their bidding and to do their work. And it always becomes a hindrance in how community can then advocate on behalf of them. So one of the conversations that came up is like, is there a call to action for land use lawyers to be like, do the good work and do the community work, not the developers work? And another thing that kind of came up was how do we begin to look at community benefit agreements, not as agreements, but as contracts that can lead to legal consequences if they are violated in the name of like for community. It happened with the village, right? One of the things that they wrote in their community benefit agreements was that they weren't going to bring any big chains into the project, and yet we have Trader Joe's and Target. So some of the conversations and ideas that can happen from there, and I'll make sure we get to the next folks who are on the thing. Thank you, Hakeem.
Jonathan Pacheco.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey, thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. This is Jonathan Pacheco Bell, embedded urban planner in Los Angeles. First of all, I want to say congratulations to everybody who graduated with their urban planning degrees within the last week or so. I see some recent graduates here, so big ups to all of you. You chose the right field. And for everyone who's going to graduate next year or in a few years from then, this network will be here for you. So stay close to us. I wanted to pick up on a thread that I noticed from Adrian, from Anish, from Richard, and also from my colleague Desiree Powell, representing Texas tonight. Hey, Desiree, talking about the baggage of working in the public sector and how do we do it? Like, how do we actually do radical planning? I can tell you one of the things that I did for the last 13 years, because I was in the public sector for 13 years, and I just made the jump 5 weeks ago to the nonprofit advocacy planning world. But I survived, and I want to tell you one of the things that I did in terms of the how. The how was framing it as I figured out, I positioned myself as like a mole within the system. That's one way that I would recommend for all of you to think about it. Like, how the hell are you going to survive when you're going up against moneyed interests, when you're going up against, electeds that may have already made their decisions, when you're going up against powerful developers? The planner has the ability to be a mole within the system, in that you are already within the the governmental structure. So one thing that I did was I just fashioned myself as a mole within the system, and I did my work. I did what was required of me in terms of the job description, but I went hella above and beyond to make sure I functioned as a mole within the system to give the community members in South Central LA, where I worked for all those years, a lot more information that they would have that more than they would have expected or known of. Because I was going well beyond my role, because I was thinking of myself as a mole within the system. So for all of you just going forward, that's 13 years of experience. I'm letting you know that is how I survived for over a decade. And it is a technique that I would recommend for all of you as you start approaching graduation and then getting into professional practice. Think of yourself as a mole within the system. Thank you.
Wow, really cool. And I think that really echoes to earlier on in the chat, Richard, when you were being very candid and frank and open. I think people appreciate transparency. And we are, yes, we're, you know, staff, or we're part of a department, we're part of a city, we're part of a firm, but we also have our own convictions. So yeah, being that mole, you know, giving information to the community that, you know, even if it's public, it's not interpreted the same. We do have to go, you know, a step beyond to just meeting the bare minimum of information sharing. So next on, we have Diana.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting this. It's been great to hear all of the resources and comments. I think someone mentioned this earlier on in the chat, but so I also went to USC, studied urban planning, and went into the public sector at first, and was met with a lot of kind of obstacles and then in general conversation with a lot of other planners of color, and people who had been there for like 20, 30 years, that there's this obstacle in like upward mobility within the profession, and this lack of racial equity. And somebody had mentioned earlier, like, is there kind of a call to action, or has there ever been for planners of color to really come together and advocate for like our own professional development? Because a lot of the time, some of these public sector agencies don't see lived experience as valuable, or see it as kind of a barrier for us to reach some of the wealthier, wider communities. And so we're not seen as true planners in that sense. And I don't know, I know that speaking to some of my previous bosses, like a lot of them were kind of like doxxed or not able to move up in their profession because of speaking up to previous management. But is that something that folks on this call are interested in organizing around, or has there ever been, is there a conversation happening now around that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. One of one of my little what do I call it? I guess dreams of sorts was to be able to look at in the same way that, you know, these folks, the new urbanists, have their Congress, like where are the people, planners of color, having our own Congress to talk about professional development, right? So one of the things that comes up a lot is that then we sort of get pigeonholed. If you come from community organizing, is that then you get pigeonholed into doing community engagement and only community engagement, but also being like, but I also have like a whole other second master's program, and like I've been doing it a career as an artist for 7 years. Like, I am a badass and I can say that, right? So I think to your point exactly, that one of the things that we were talking about and following through would be, what would it look like if we imagined a Planners of Color Congress and created with our code of ethics that talked about professional development in the way that we would move forward in investing in communities through an equitable lens. So thank you for bringing that up. That's definitely one of the things we'll take down note of and continue to move forward. And again, to be completely transparent, there were no real deliverables and what's going to happen after this, because again, I did not imagine that 250 of y'all were going to get on the call today. So I'm super grateful. And I think as these points are coming up, let's strategize and organize about how we can continue doing this. I see someone, right? Let's organize a radical planning conference without the barriers of access, exactly, which are memberships and dues and all that. Okay, we're going to our own anti-APA. Oh God. Okay, see, look, this is why we get in trouble. Next.
Okay, great. We have James Rojas.
Hey, Richard, great to see you. I haven't talked to you in a while. But I think one of the issues with transportation and Vision Zero is that we have to develop a Latino transportation plan. Call it what it is. You have 85% Latinos riding public transportation in LA. It should be a Latino plan. It's not fixing the system for Latinos, but making it aspirational for us. that should be our system. That should be the right. We need to make planning aspirational and create our own Black, Latino land use plans. Otherwise, we'll just become second rate all the time. So it's going deeper into this whole planning world and say we need to change the way land use is allocated. What are our cultural values of space? How does a Latina woman see her street? Where she lives at. So going deeper in the whole planning world to create our own land use plans. Big comment. Thanks.
Thank you, James. And I totally agree with you, right? When we're looking at the ridership, specifically in Los Angeles, and I'm sure this is the same across many different cities, it is people of color who are riding the bus, right? So how do we create ways in which and we create and take ownership of our own plans in the way that you mentioned, James, and it's also good to see you on the call. And how do we take ownership of that? There are organizations out of Portland who have done, I don't know their names, I'll look them up and add them to this list, but it was an organization where they created their own a master plan for the Black community, right? So also another thing, it's like if institutions are not creating necessarily these spaces for us, how do we then take ownership of that, of our profession and the skills that we have, leverage our privilege and create our own plans, right? And bring them up. So thank you for allowing us to imagine that as well.
Andrea Zhang.
Hi. Oh, you're fine. It's Andrea. I'm calling from Tallahassee, Florida, and thank you all so much for everything y'all have said. When I hear about what's happening, especially in California, it's just like a vision of possibility for what I want in the South. There have been comments about like sticky notes on maps or CBAs. My city, Tallahassee, to my knowledge, has never had a CBA. Our university laughed at us when we tried to include one in a plan we were working on before COVID. 3 years ago, I would say, is when the sticky notes on a map made it. Sorry, my LED lights are freaking out, but sticky notes on maps happened maybe 3 years ago here. So we're, I guess what I want to say is, because everything is going online with Zoom right now, we used to just watch videos of meetings and things that were happening in California and places where planning is in a much more equitable place. I know that y'all have a lot of issues still too, but I hope that in the future when physical meeting spaces are more able to happen, that things will continue happening on Zoom so that we can interact with y'all and keep hearing about the work y'all are doing, because I think we really need to see that, to know that we can get places in the South to where y'all are right now. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, I think one of the great things that came out of this was leveling the playing field as far as who has a power over a call-in or, video chat. Like now we all have an equal voice, and it's not just the person in the conference room. Like if we want to get ourselves to the table, get ourselves to the meeting, like we can show up there with less barriers, and now people respect just technology now in a different way. So yeah, that's a great point. Gabriel?
Hi, I'll turn my video on. Hi, thank you for putting this on. This is hella dope. I just wanted to see what everybody's thoughts were of sort of methods or ways to bring about the conversation and highlighting the issues that wealthy and white areas have in this also, because we talk a lot about all the issues in the hood, like either disinvestment or gentrification, but also wealthy areas like in LA, I think of like the West Side or Orange County are also complicit in this in their own ways. What are your thoughts in sort of bringing the conversation and like talking about issues within those areas that create issues, therefore, in the hood?
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you, Gabriel, for bringing that up. To be completely honest, I think that has been one of the hardest things that I've been trying to navigate being in the department, because I'm asked to be neutral, but Lord knows that my radical spirit won't allow me to. I think there have been very wonderful conversations.
I think that's me. I accidentally muted you, sorry.
Okay. And I think definitely being able to get co-conspirators, right? So I had someone, I think in the chat box I saw, how do white allies be part of this conversation? And I think a lot of that is being like, yo, listen, I can't go to Pacific Palisades and bring this up. Like, I can't, like, you know, they're gonna look at me and who knows what's gonna happen. But I think that is a way in which this conversation needs to be owned by all of us, right? Like, and it's a conversations that are happening in all sectors, right? How are we dismantling white supremacy? This is what it is. When we talk about radicalizing urban planning, really is recognizing and reconciling with the fact that white supremacy has permeated everywhere, including our fields. We need to take ownership of it, and then also be creating our own co-conspirators, right? So when folks be like, yo, listen, what can it be? Listen, Maggie, I can't show up to this meeting right quick, so can you show up for me? And having those co-conspirators, I think it's also an important conversation, because that's how we can, you know, create from multiple levels, right? And also to Andrea's point, like, thank you for being here. You're not connected with us. Whatever comes out of this, you are part of this network, and by all means, you'll get an email from me, because there is no organization. Nobody's getting paid for this. This is just what happened. And so you'll be getting an email from me, and you'll have my personal contact. And if it's not someone that I know, it might be someone that I can connect you with. So thank you for that. We have a couple of more hands. I see 4 hands. And I think just kind of looking at the time, it's 7:18 now. We've been here now for 1 hour and 18 minutes. Let's continue the conversation till about 7:30. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, both on the West Coast and the East Coast. So we'll take these next couple of hands.
Teddy?
Hi there. Just want to give a quick background. I come from a GIS background, but I originally studied urban planning and environmental justice in a general sense. It was like an interdisciplinary major. Anyways, so I was just curious, because I've been thinking a lot about movement building as inherent to creating change. And so I think, I forgot exactly who said it earlier, but basically, using our knowledge as planners, or your knowledge as planners, how do we get the average person to know what their power is? I know, Jose, you mentioned earlier power mapping, and I just think that's just like a really powerful thing to, I guess, emphasize, because I think especially right now with everything going on, like, people are realizing that, 1, protests and pushing for change works, and 2, there's so much that the average person doesn't know. And I think right now, a lot of people are actually turning to experts and people like you who have been studying this and doing this for years. To sum it up, like, is there any like organizations or actions happening right now that are in the LA area that I could help out with or join? Anyone in the group? Yeah.
It's very cool. I know that there were some like calls to action last year for Abundant Housing LA for GIS mapping. And that's a great point. Like, what are the skill sets that we can use in GIS that could help this move in particular? I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to the chat. That'd be great. Okay, Erica Barbero.
Hi, everyone. So again, my name is Erica. I'm a graduate student at UC Irvine. Some of my cohort members are on the call right now. But I wanted to, get some feedback on folks on, changing up the curriculum and planning, because I know, USC and UCLA are highly championed in the planning fields, but there are other programs that are just as that have students who are just as brilliant and bright and really radical. But the curriculum is not servicing or meeting our needs. So, what can we as planning students do to hold our professors accountable, hold our institution accountable in radicalizing the planning curriculum in particular, as well as making it more accessible to K through 12 and community college systems, because I know myself and a lot of other folks have mentioned that we kind of stumbled upon planning. It wasn't something that was intentional because, we don't know what it was. So I know I threw a lot out there, but again, radicalizing the curriculum and, making it more accessible so that we have more, brilliant folks in the field and, creating change in our cities.
Thank you for that, Erica. And I totally agree with you, right? I stumbled into urban planning. Literally, it wasn't until graduate school that my professor, Lisa Schweitzer, was like, girl, you're an urban planner. Like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, my bad. I just like riding the bus, So definitely, I think that in addition to that, we stumbled into it. There is a project that came out of our school, USC school, right? A couple of students got together and looked through the core syllabi and looked at the writing that we were drawing from, right? Who were the scholars that we were drawing from, and how many of their scholars were people of color, and how many were their women. And of course, they found out that our curriculum was predominantly writings of white men. And I think there's an understanding of like, yes, there was these white men who kind of had these writings, but we shouldn't look to them as truth. We should look to them as fallacies and also bring in critique, right? And it's like that demographic has changed. Like Kevin Lynch's work is beautiful, but like I want to reimagine Los Angeles as a queer, like let me create my own image of the city through the lens of a queer bus rider from South Central, right? So I think that there's definitely opportunities, and I think there's an specifically it's with USC and UCLA students. I'll make sure that we connect in that way and say, how do we as students bring in our own curriculum, right? Like somebody also mentioned in the chats, how do we bring in ethnic studies into our urban planning curriculum, and critical race theory? I think it's super important also to bring in, because so much of our profession was racialized in its inception, right? So how do we bring in critical race theory also into the curriculum? Thank you, Erica.
Great. Lulu.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to see everybody. And I just want to say I'm a Angelino, but I worked for the last 10 years in New York on housing planning. And I just wanted to uplift Gabriel's point around what is the responsibility to sort of confront white, wealthy neighborhoods. And for the last 4 years, I was working on a plan in New York called Where We Live NYC that was a fair housing planning process. And we were able to do a real kind of use the city's fear of being sued to hold really incredible space to listen as a city. And so we actually, we were able to bring together advocates and actually hold 60 focus groups across the city in 15 different languages and really learn from folks about what an integrated neighborhood meant to them and how we could build confront segregation in New York City. And I'm happy to share more about that work. But one of the best, my favorite parts was on a group of advocates, the HUD framework that we used for the planning process sort of use this term called recaps, which are racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. And they're like, those are the areas that we need to fix. Those are the areas that like this plan is here to solve. And all these advocates in the room looked at us and they're like, those are not the areas that need to be fixed. It's the white, wealthy enclaves that are really the places where we need to put our attention and think about what does it take to transform those areas into to spaces of inclusion for folks who may want to go there. And it was my role as a white planner and advocate inside government to make sure that voice was amplified, and it really transformed the way that we thought about the plan, and we had some amazing leadership to carry that forward. So I just want to uplift that there's always opportunities to try and get at the sort of the frameworks that we use are often in and of themselves sort of very racist in how they make assumptions, and it's our job to challenge those and to create space to listen. And so I wanted to uplift that, and also my co-conspirator on that project helped lead the New York City's they have the diversity, the planning association there, the American Planning Association there has a diversity and inclusion committee that went totally radical, and they are all about getting planners of color sort of connected in the public sector and promoted, and they have a radical conference that they host in New York called Hindsight, which I think could be a model that could be scaled. And so I just wanted to uplift and amplify that, and I think Sean put it in the chat as well. But I'm here to support and to share wisdom and sending you all love. This gives me so much hope in a time where it's really hard to be a public servant right now. So thank you, Jose, and everybody.
Very cool, thanks. Even what you mentioned, like the economics of collective power, like, yeah, like you're afraid of being sued. That's an opportunity for people that actually have a voice to be listened to. I think I unmuted Cristina Delgado.
Yes. I am calling from Los Angeles, and I just had a question about what a lot of people were discussing, coming from graduate programs, coming from academic backgrounds, and myself being interested in continuing my education with urban planning or with public policy, and a lot of the issues that you all were discussing about going into these programs and seeing the disparities or seeing the discrepancies of your education, where you're coming from. I myself have considered going to colleges or doing studies like outside of Los Angeles. And having been from Los Angeles, I want to just get a different perspective, and I just wanted to know if there was some advice people had about the being from Los Angeles and being from and going to a different place and a different community, and how to sort of toe the line between being a romantic and being a somebody who's trying to fight for the community you come from, and using information from different places and building on that.
Yeah.
Great.
Sorry. Thank you for that question, comment, Christina. I think one of the things that I learned from me was always looking at my mother and being like, if my mother can understand what I'm talking about, then I'm doing a good job. And I only say that because my mother is also my conscience, and it's sort of where my commitment to community comes from, right? Like one of the things that I remind myself is that when they see streets, I see my childhood. When they see property, I see my high school. And when they see small businesses, I see the panaderia that I still buy bread from so they stay afloat. And I think to the point that also Jonathan brought up is this mindset, right? Like all of a sudden, I had to become like a malinche in the public sector, right? And being able to translate the language between the fields and being like, okay, cool, but what you're talking about is just called this, right? And so one of the examples in how it came up was for a workshop, right? We had to do this workshop, and we realized that all the folks who came into this workshop were all drivers, and that we did not have any, our sample for transit riders was very small. And I just said the most common sense thing that made sense to me. And I was like, well, why don't we just go to the bus stops? And sure enough, we went to bus stops, and we had like so many, like we conducted over like 100 and something surveys with transit riders, and then our data and design looked completely different because we included transit riders, right? So I think always putting those needs of community first is so important in the way that we do the work. And again, for me, my commitment is to residents, not to institutions. So thank you, Christina, and we'll continue. Okay, can I define Malinche? Yes, so I'm going to define, that's a hard one. So I see 5 more folks on the queue. We'll end it at that, and then we'll wrap it up and continue having these conversations. So Malinche, Malinche is a whole nother conversation. But Malinche, indigenous woman who ended up getting sold by her mom a couple of times, and she ends in the hands of Hernan Cortes. What happens then, sort of in addition to all the horrors of colonization, Malinche becomes, or Malinali, Malintzin, Doña Marina, she becomes Cortez's translator. So she was translating between the different indigenous languages into Spanish and vice versa. And she is also then seen as sort of like, she's blamed for the downfall of it all and seen as the mother of mestizos. And at the same time, I think that Malinche was just trying to survive, and she was trying to work within the systems and trying to, we don't know what she was saying. She might have been planning the revolution and it didn't go the way that she planned. And to me now, I take Malinche as sort of sitting in the in-between of spaces of gender, of sexuality, and of institutions, and being able to translate for community.
Hey, yeah, Richard. So we do have a few more hands, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So if maybe we just start closing remarks, and if you have your hand raised, if you can maybe write your question or comment in the chat box, and then it'll be recorded with the chat notes. And also, I forgot to mention that you can make a copy. I think you can export the chat and take it with you. I'm not sure how to do that, but somebody mentioned that to me. But yeah, Richard, do you want to?
Yeah. So I see a couple of more hands. So that being said, thank you so much for joining us. Please write your comments and questions into that chat box so we have them and we can follow up as well, and we can all see the conversation. Yes, so the presentation has been recorded, and it's been broadcasted on Facebook Live, so it'll be saved in that capacity. I'll also save it on what's that thing? Oh, I'm going to try to upload an IGTV. I also see if we can have a copy of the presentation. Most definitely, I'll do that. And I think what I'll do, because I've gotten a little bit better at this, Screencastify, I'll narrate over the presentation itself and share the narration as well. So you get both the talk and the whole conversation, and then you get the presentation as well. And so again, if we would like to continue the conversation, please sign in at the bottom, form that was submitted here. We're going to get all those responses and follow up with the sort of synthesizing all the notes that were shared and everything that was brought up in this call. And then we'll find a way and how we can move forward. And please know that this is not going to be the last call. And thank you so much for coming tonight. There were a total of 255 of y'all who got on this call. And I'm super grateful. It's not the last one, I hope. And have a good night, everyone. Did I miss anything?
No, that's all.
Okay, bueno, besos y abrazos, hugs, and love to all of you. And thank you so much for joining today, this call. And again, la lucha sigue. We're still in this fight. Thank you so much for coming. I am saving the chat now so I have it, and then we can, okay. Oh, Jesus, okay.
Everyone's doing their send-offs.
Right, I'm like, oh my goodness. All of a sudden, there were 55 people. Okay. Oh, I can just click that. No, save chat. Thank you so much. Again, I'm ending the call now. It was a pleasure meeting all of you, even through this. And thank you so much for coming. And you'll be getting an email from me shortly. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.